We'll go ahead and get going in the interest of time. My name is Chris Miller. We're doing this presentation as a follow-up to last month's presentation around cloud automation with SDDC. So for those of you who attended that session, thank you. And this is a follow-on to that. For those of you who didn't attend, that was more of a technically focused marketing webinar, really around getting through the marketing of automation and talking about how customers are actually implementing automation within their environment. This presentation is going to be a little bit more focused around how to operationalize automation and SDDC within your organization. So a lot less technical, more focused on people, process, and how to be successful when taking on an automation initiative with VMware SDDC. So bear with me while I learn PowerPoint. Okay, so just a quick review of the agenda. We'll talk a little bit about cloud operations management and some of the challenges that need to be solved when adopting a cloud operations model within the organization. We'll talk through people and process, organizational structure, and how that is impacted by leveraging SDDC and automation. Finally, how are we going to operationalize all of these things with the SDDC technologies in the vRealize suite, and how Rolta AdvizeX can help your organization through that process. So just a quick overview of cloud operations management. SDDC obviously is a set of products that VMware could provide to enable sort of a self-service, automated, efficient IT infrastructure. But along with that, obviously, we need to address the people and the process side as well. So when building a private cloud within your organization, on the people side, you really need to take a look at how your organization is structured to support the operational model, as it does vary quite a bit from traditional legacy IT models. The other side of that is you need to make sure you have adequate training and skills to support the operational model. Otherwise, you'll continue to have issues as you transform your organization. On the process side, we need to look at how we integrate into existing processes within IT with the least amount of disruption, but driving value and changing the organization and transforming around automation and cloud services. And then what do we need to do in order to change to that? There's obviously going from where we're at today to where the ideal state for your organization is in the future. And then finally, on the technology side of it is how do we leverage the tools that are part of the vRealize suite to support the new operational model? And what other tools the organization already has that can help support that as well. So just to kind of give a little bit of background and why this is necessary, and I'm sure you've seen this in some format or another, but we've kind of entered a new era in compute where we now all operate under the premise of cloud computing, which really isn't a specific technology, but it's a new way of operating IT. So the expectations are changing for IT within the organization. In the past, it was really about keeping the lights on and supporting business critical applications for customers and for internal folks to help run your business. The new expectations are that we're going to leverage technology to give us a competitive advantage as an organization. And with that, we're going to develop our own unique sort of products and services to help make that happen. And you think about how your organization interacts with users through mobile applications, web-based applications and so forth. It's a lot different than it used to be in the past, where most of the systems we ran were to support our internal operations. So we need to be strategic. At the same time, we're driving operational excellence, which can be tricky because every time we try to be strategic and do new things, we obviously are making a change in operational process and we're introducing new things to the organization. So trying to maintain, innovation, but at the same time, make that work with operations is tricky with a legacy model. We need to be quick to adopt new technologies and avoid the legacy debt that we have within the organization. And we need to boost innovation while staying secure. And balancing these things becomes tricky for a traditional organization in a cloud world. So what we end up with is sort of a very complicated approach from an executive CIO level all the way down through the organization, where we look at, from an application perspective, how things are transforming. In the past, most of our applications ran on-prem, communicated with each other on-prem in the data center, and now we are starting to see cloud-native applications being built that encompass mobile, distributed systems across one cloud or multiple clouds and regions, as well as consuming SaaS applications, as opposed to doing legacy installs and maintenance. On the infrastructure side, we're moving away from the legacy stack, which is really mostly on-prem, and now we're moving to a sort of hybrid model where some of your applications, some of your infrastructure runs in a public cloud, and much of it remains private. And depending on the organization, that could be, you know, a varying percentage of public versus private workloads, just depending on your needs. Obviously, if we want to be able to take advantage of what we have, and we want to be able to build on top of vSphere internally, but still support this new operating model. So to do that, we need to look at people. We need to understand their existing skills. And an example there is when you move to an SDDC model, you start operating on policy and configuring on policy. So it's a policy-driven infrastructure. And when you layer automation into the mix, you're now basically building code and deploying infrastructure and applications through a coding mechanism. So if you don't have those skill sets in IT, or you don't have an in-house development shop, it's very vital that you learn technologies to support, so that you, as you continue to manage by policy and automation, you're able to extend the platform to meet your needs. From a process perspective, it becomes very difficult to automate things when you have silos making decisions. And I'll give you an example. If you automate your network, and today your network's, let's say, a Cisco network, and your automation team, you know, builds workflow and process to manipulate switching and routing within your environment, that works until somebody changes, you know, the type of network gear that you're purchasing. And if a silo is making that decision, if that's solely coming out of network without respect to the automation platform and the amount of work that goes into building that, what you end up with is a problem where the new infrastructure can no longer be utilized with the investment of time and effort that you put into automating it. So you really have to break those silos down by either facilitating, you know, sort of a cross-team form of communication, or restructuring the organization to support a group-based decision-making process around architecture and new implementation, to avoid some of the headaches that you'll run into if you break the automation you put in place. From an organizational perspective, that when you introduce cloud into the mix, you now have a need for even more in terms of cross-functional teams, because in the cloud, you're not necessarily managing at the infrastructure layer, you're managing at the application and service layer. So that requires us to adjust our governance models. It requires us to integrate better with our developers. And then from an infrastructure perspective, make sure that we're bringing in, you know, application architecture and business requirements into the decision-making process. Just to kind of say, you know, what is an operational model? It's really just a description of how you do things and who interacts. So part of that would be defining roles within the organization. And those roles for large organizations might map one-to-one to an individual full-time employee. In other cases, the roles may be roles that you add to existing employees and existing teams. But the important thing is to look at it from a role perspective and how those roles interface with each other to provide the level of interaction and insight to be able to build the automated platform. So what we'll do is look at how would we get to a point where we're now driving IT as a service, where we can transform roles and take a service-oriented approach. Obviously, we always look at people, process, and technology within a cloud. And, you know, from the people perspective, we've talked a bit about that. We'll get more into the organizational side as well as the process. From a technology standpoint, obviously, SDDC becomes the foundation, and vRealize suite on top to provide cloud management. Once we started talking about a service-oriented approach, we have to change how we think about providing services back to the business. So if you look at an Amazon or an Azure, they obviously have a service catalog that they've defined, and they manage the life cycle of that service catalog. Typically within IT organizations in the commercial space, it's not quite as structured. The service is really providing infrastructure, and we interface with the application teams and business analysts to run workloads on that infrastructure. But we aren't necessarily creating and defining a service end-to-end with the application teams and the infrastructure teams together. Really needs to be focused on designing those services to provide certain business outcomes. So if you're looking at designing things to make your life easier, that's good. But in the end, you have to look at the business outcome and drive towards that. And that's one way to integrate IT into the business and keep closer tabs on what the needs are. But it also has a play in how you life cycle manage the entire service. And obviously, we need to take characteristics into play, right? We need to define KPIs. We need to make sure we understand requirements around security, capacity, quality of service, and so forth. And once we get to that point where we're now providing services that are defined and managed through a life cycle, we can actually begin to behave like a service provider, at which point we can begin to measure the cost of those services, the KPIs, whether we're meeting those KPIs or not, and the business that can interface with IT as a service provider. And to illustrate what that looks like, we'll go into a little more detail around the people and process side of cloud ops. So if you look at a traditional model, which is fairly common in most of the organizations that I've worked with, you've got sort of a central IT organization, or what a lot of people will call shared services, and it's typically a combination of infrastructure, data, application teams, and a lot of times, client and end user as well. And then you've got the business themselves divided into different views and departments that are consuming the services being provided. There's typically an IT business analyst that serves as the middle ground between the business and IT. So on one hand, he's able to speak in business terms, but on the other hand, speak in technical terms and help to bring those business requirements, translate those into IT services, at which point IT can then provide those services back to the business and provide direct delivery of the platform to the users. In a lot of cases, rogue users will do all this by themselves. So when they have a need, they'll go off and figure out how to build their own Wi-Fi with a hub under their desk, or download and install their own application that they can run to meet their needs. So the problem with this model is we don't always capture all of the requirements from the business. We just simply don't have enough business analysts, or they're focused on the larger projects. And then that gives users the ability to go out and create their own services and consume cloud services that your organization wasn't able to provide. To shift to a service-oriented operating framework is a goal to help address that problem. And when we do that, we have to take into consideration now we have a couple new management, I'll say, functions that get put into place. One of those is the cloud service management, and it's adjusting and adapting your NTSM processes to be able to provide highly agile environments for folks. So think of that as self-service, request on demand for, things like provisioning VMs, provisioning applications, or even just making a change. And in order to kind of put all of those services together and manage them strategically, you really need to have portfolio management. So it's building an internal service catalog that takes into consideration all the business requirements, the business strategy, and then governing that. And when we look at that, how we control it, we have operations, implementation, and business control. And each of these roles are going to be part of the operating framework. Like any other framework, you really want to adopt a service-driven maturity model, where most organizations start down in the ad hoc basic range and it's more of a reactive type of approach. We need to take a look at driving through an iterative process to an optimized IT as a service model within the organization. And this is a journey. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that executive management needs to buy into and needs to get behind, needs to understand it's iterative, and you're always going to be improving services that you provide to your organization. But if you look at everything from a service perspective, going through this maturity model, being able to gauge the level of maturity that you currently have within your services and adopting a framework to measure that maturity is something that needs to be considered. In order to do that, then, we need to have a life cycle that we stick to for each service within our service catalog. So from that perspective, we feed business objectives into the life cycle, at which point we're going to define, implement, operate, improve, and analyze the use cases. Obviously, analyze comes first. I apologize for that. And you do this for each service, and you do this every time a service goes through a major revision. And you follow this life cycle with infrastructure and application teams as one. So think of it as aligning infrastructure requirements and application life cycle under one single life cycle that we'll call a service life cycle. The idea is to crawl, walk, and run. You don't want to try to run out the door, completely optimized, because what ends up happening is perfect becomes the enemy of good enough, and you wind up spending months or years trying to figure out how you're going to get a perfect service with perfect implementation, at which point the service itself can become irrelevant. So you really want to start, looking at minimally viable processes to support infrastructure as a service, and focus on automating that, getting a grip around proactive monitoring and improving so that you can report on your KPIs and understand how you're going to calculate cost of that service for the individuals. Once we've gotten that down and we're able to now at least automate deployments of services, that's when we can really start looking at doing phase two, where we're now doing more proactive operations, and we're automating some of the day two changes that we make within the environment. We're adapting to more of an agile-based service development lifecycle, so we're chunking things out and taking things in stride, and obviously then integrate a little bit more tightly with our ITSM platform and processes. Once we move to phase 3 is when we're really truly moving on as an operator of a service provider, or operational service provider, where we can provide those services at a specific cost to the customer. They can request those on demand, scale those on demand, and you've spent the first 2 phases making sure your capacity management and your KPIs and your monitoring are in place so that you can be ahead of that without having to worry about over provisioning and so forth. And that's when we really start to look at enforcing service level agreements. So this gives you a chance to work out some of the, I'll say, bugs with the service offering as you move through this process. And what that kind of looks like as an example in the crawl aspect. We have all of these areas in cloud service management, which really aligns with ITSM. From a service operations control perspective, we're dealing with capacity management, config management, availability, performance, and so forth. From an implementation perspective, we're defining requirements. We're making sure we're moving to a continuous integration and deployment model for our applications we develop. We have a release management framework in place so that we can version those and move them forward. And we have adequate architecture and design with those cross-functional teams. And finally, we start to put our hands around financial management and supplier management. And again, let's just get the minimally viable processes in place to support this. Once we move into the walk phase and we've got a pretty good grip on our services, we know that our automation's working, we're able to apply that back to the business, is when you start adding in marketing function. Now, obviously, you guys aren't, Azure, or maybe Azure's on the line, but you're not a cloud provider. But you have to think about this from internal marketing perspective. So branding your portal, branding your service offerings, getting the word to the business, making sure people know how to consume the services. It's really internal marketing. And at that point, we're going to start reporting on, service levels to management as well as back to the business, so they understand what they're getting from a service offering matches the SLOs or SLAs you have in place. And then finally, once we start to run is when we get a grip on multiple services within the organization, driving in security and access management with every service and bringing them in. We have now risk management around this, and we built service portfolio management because in many cases, you have lots of services that you provide back to your business users. As an example, you may have VM provisioning, but you also might have database as a service. You may have analytics as a service. You may have Hadoop as a service, and so forth. So you really need to have some portfolio management and lifecycle around that. And if you think about how the OEMs interface with you as a customer, you guys have early access or early adopter type, applications and hardware, all the way to general availability to late deployment and finally phasing that service or that product out. And you need to sort of take that same approach within your organization, communicate when things are going to end of life from a service perspective, how you're going to transition support into the replacement service, communicate that internally so that you're behaving more like a service provider. Obviously, this takes a lot of work, and in some cases, it means new teams or it means new functions within the organization. But you're encouraged to figure out how to do this. Otherwise, what you end up with is a tool that the business isn't driving maximum value out of. From a purely organizational perspective, if we look at organizing IT, that means we now have sort of this transition to a cloud infrastructure services team. You'll have cloud services teams, which are really more focused on portfolio management and driving that into the business. Integrating that with your hybrid cloud platform. If you have, SaaS-based applications in the cloud, as an example, that need to be provisioned along with other things internally on the VM side, and take a look at, the business as service consumers. So you sort of now treat internal business units as a customer who are consuming your service, and you're providing back to them and reporting visibility and a set of SLOs that you're achieving. So how do we do that? For one, if we kind of look at why we need to do this, the traditional teams that we have in place today is a typical networking, storage, security, compute sort of siloed team. And we want to bring all of those folks together into a single cloud operations team or SDDC operations team. We've worked with a number of customers who have done this, and there's a couple of ways to implement it. Obviously, you could create a specific team with specific roles, or you could form a virtual team within your organization that provides the same function. So when you see these roles and organizations and departments, don't think that, hey, my company's too small, I only have a couple guys, I can't grow this out. There's no way I'm going to be able to build a team. Think of it more as a set of functions and treating those functions the same within the framework, as opposed to individual roles or people fulfilling those functions. So we need to have some sort of converged SDDC cloud infrastructure function. They, again, could be one or two people, or it could be an entire team. And then those folks would then integrate with what we'll call tenant operations, which would really kind of fall toward the business analyst spectrum. So it's folks who are dealing with the business, figuring out how we're going to operate tenants and provide services, align services to the appropriate business units and so forth. What we end up then with is a set of teams, or again, functions, where we have a cloud infrastructure services team. We have a cloud services team, which is really a service analyst side, looking at service from an architecture perspective. A business relationship manager, sort of high-level interfaces with the business to make sure that the services we're providing are adequate. And then a portfolio management team who can look at everything broadly and determine how to divide that up and organize that into a portfolio that can be consumed by the business. So kind of breaking that down a bit and looking at the roles within these teams. You've got the cloud infrastructure service developer. They're responsible for cloud infrastructure automation and integration. So from a vRealize perspective, these are the folks who are in the process of developing XaaS workflows and lifecycle extensibility within VRA and providing blueprints that would be consumed. You have a service owner, which again could be the same role, could be others, but they own the lifecycle and the 360 definition process. So they're really responsible for interfacing with service architects and the business to make sure we have the right services in place. We also have infrastructure service architect, which again is responsible for the architecture side of SDDC. We've got engineers who are responsible for building out the infrastructure. We've got analysts who are responsible for monitoring and making sure that things are going the way that they should be and that our SLAs are being met and that we're dealing with events proactively. And finally, we've got service administrators who are kind of responsible for managing, auditing the infrastructure services. On the cloud services team, again, this is another function that may overlap with folks from the previous team, but this is really folks who are looking more at XaaS service deployment and specifically for external systems and things that you're trying to accomplish internally. So for those who didn't make the first presentation, XaaS is really just taking anything that you can deploy today, whether it's an application or some process, and creating that as a service so that it's consumable in a catalog with a request process. So the service developer is going to be looking at where do we need that. For example, I can use vRealize automation to completely automate Office 365 without the need to do, buy something separate or buy another product to do that. But in order to do that, you really have to have somebody who's developing that integration and interfacing with Office 365 APIs the way that your business needs to. So that responsibility would fall within this team. Again, some of the same roles, owner, architect, QA, analyst, and administrator, all similarly structured the way that the infrastructure service team is as well. Finally, we got the business relationship manager and the portfolio management team. So the business relationship manager, again, is looking at line of business stakeholders, understanding service needs, and looking for demand moving forward. So they're really the interface with executive level and departmental level management within your organization to figure out the types of services that need to be consumed, and then what those definitions need to look like, the requirements, and how we're going to bring that back and prioritize it for the rest of the business. The cloud business manager then is obviously responsible for tracking cloud applications and source costing and so forth. So they're looking at consumption, they're building show back and charge back reports, or in certain cases, if you're doing true chargeback, interfacing with the business to make sure that costs are in line and those sorts of things. The portfolio manager then is looking at all of the cloud services and working with IT to develop the overall offering strategy. And they're, again, managing the cloud offering catalog within the service portal, making sure that aligns with what the business relationship manager is asking for. And finally, you'll have, a policy blueprint manager. What we see in most organizations is we don't wind up with, 15 different jobs. What ends up happening is certain of these functions are collapsed and assigned to individuals. So somebody who, for example, may be a virtualization guy who's now become the cloud service architect will have multiple roles, and that person may also directly interface with the business. So part of this model is figuring out what is right for your business based on the size of your business, how you're planning to scale, the amount of services that you're planning to automate and provide back to the business, and just the available number of resources within the organization. And part of why we encourage the use of technologies like VMware Cloud Foundation at the SDDC layer for infrastructure is by bringing that technology in place, you're no longer spending as much time on trying to figure out how you're just going to upgrade to the next version of vSphere and interfacing with multiple teams to make sure you have the right firmware and all those things figured out. With VCF, you press a button, you schedule the update, you move on. And by leveraging those types of technologies that make life easier for your infrastructure team, you're now providing time back to the infrastructure team so that they can take on these additional roles and responsibilities and help transform the organization without being overwhelmed and having to work 80 hours a week. Although I can't guarantee you will still work 80 hours a week, but the goal is obviously to provide some level of relief so that you can focus on this. Now, we'll look at an operating model, again, in a little bit more detail. How do we glue all these pieces together? So we have our lifecycle management, we've got portfolio management, and we've got business demand management. As you can see, the business relationship managers are going to be seeking out line of business leaders, having discussions, marketing the services. Cloud infrastructure services, of course, is going to help provide a lot of that technical detail and service detail to the business relationship manager so that they're able to communicate that back to the business. Portfolio management then is going to provide transition decisions and lifecycle. And that's really going to get fed back into the cloud service lifecycle management team is going to implement that. The business relationship manager is also going to be looking at forecasting forward service demand and communicating that to portfolio management, who will in turn then prioritize team populating the service catalog with consumable services, at which point it gets communicated back to the line of business and the business is able to consume those services. Now, if you look at it from the business's perspective, they're going to request those services through a portal. In the case of SDDC, that portal would be vRealize Automation. And then the lifecycle management team and cloud services team are going to be able to provide that self-service automated request fulfillment whenever possible. Finally, then, we encourage people to spin up at least a portion of their time or a portion of the team to create a digital innovation lab. And this can just be a lab in your environment that is maybe another instance of VRA that mirrors your production SDDC deployment, where you can begin to develop these workflows and find the best approaches and test them before you would send them out live to the business. Finally, once we get to sort of the fully matured model, is when we bring in cloud service management to sort of interface again between the business and the cloud services lifecycle team. And that allows us to scale because at some point we're not going to be able to directly interface with the business. And the cloud service management team is going to be responsible for ITSM and incident problem management. So once we're able to transform sort of legacy ITSM operations into cloud service management, when we have a catalog and we've got a set of services we're providing, this is sort of the ultimate end state. Now, how the cloud service teams interact then is another consideration. So if I've got a service owner who's responsible for designing, building, deploying, automating, operating the cloud, whether that's public, private, on-prem, hybrid, et cetera, we now need to bring in a service owner that's going to look at defining and costing those services back to the business. Obviously, that by itself has its own set of goals and challenges around costing and building that model. And so really you need that function either on your infrastructure services team or in your cloud service teams themselves. They're going to look at how we're going to do policy-based automated service provisioning. So think of the bottom layer as folks who are building out the infrastructure and the top layer as folks who are building out the cloud catalog and vRealize automation. And so between the two of these, we're able to communicate and create the correct blueprints that are required to make this happen. Add in then, you have a portal and we're going to provide some sort of service back to the consumers, whether that's infrastructure, PaaS, it could be digital workspace, big data, and so forth. And the service consumers then will consume the services that these two teams jointly put together. And then finally, we want to bring in obviously the governance side of it, enterprise, governance and framework around it, project management and so forth as we integrate those pieces in. As an example, here's platform as a service. Your consumer in this case may be your DevOps team. Now, obviously, most other folks aren't going to necessarily need a platform as a service unless they're developers, but your organization may have various teams that have past needs that aren't just application developers. But the idea is you want to tailor your service offering and all the governance and things that are required to the specific needs of the consumers themselves. In the case of analytics as a service, you may have, your customer maybe say marketing. But one thing to notice here is really just between the two of these, and I'll go back and forth to make it simpler, is the service owner needs to decide specifically for that platform what's required. Right, in the case of app dev, policy-based automated service provisioning might be a requirement, but in the case of analytics, we need to figure out how we're going to ingest, aggregate, and access development for that. So each specific platform may have its own pieces, right? Platform quality and platform operations are important for developers, but data quality and data lake operations are more important for data and analytics. So think of each service. The one thing you will see is obviously the infrastructure components and the business governance side sort of stay the same, depending on the service that you're offering. But specifically the service that you're providing to the consumer is going to have more specific concerns and needs. And that's where you really need to have this cloud services team defining that specifically for the consumers and the service within your organization. Hopefully that makes sense. Maybe another more tangible example, which I don't unfortunately have in the slides, would be, for providing desktop as a service, for example. We're not going to be concerned about data lakes and ingestion of data. There we may be more concerned about remote access and how we're going to connect outside, device management, whether those are managed, unmanaged, user-owned, or company-owned, and those sorts of things. So those all become aspects of the service that you're defining and providing back to the business. Now with that, there's obviously the people, process, and technology side. So what does vRealize Automation, or vRealize Suite rather, provide to give us the technology enablement required for this? So the first and foremost is vRealize Automation. And vRealize Automation is policy-based governance, interfacing with SDDC technologies to provide infrastructure application and custom services. This is also where we're going to have our self-service portal that our consumers interact with, make requests, provide approvals for workflows and so forth, and where infrastructure folks are going to manage deployed workloads. So this is sort of the glue that orchestrates all automation and the service catalog and brings those two pieces together so that you can define and expose the service to the organization. On the financial management side, the business management side, part of the suite then is vRealize Business. And what vRealize Business is going to do is integrate with vRealize Automation and the operations platform, and it's going to help you understand what your true costs are. And it can do things, for example, like if you have a placement of a new workload, it can help you determine whether it's more cost effective to do that on-prem or to do it in the public cloud. We also have the ability to benchmark our organization's costs against other folks in the industry, as well as public cloud providers. And it gives us a method then to help with service quality management and cost reporting to figure out where our efficiencies and inefficiencies are at. And so there's different consumer level folks who leverage this tool. We have organizations where, IT management will leverage the tool just as a way to keep their thumb on costs and understand, where things are expensive and which systems are costing them the most. In other cases, these reports are consumed by financial people within the organization all the way up to the CFO. So it really just depends on your needs and how you want to structure, if at all, chargeback versus showback and those sorts of things. Finally, there's vRealize Operations Manager in combination with Log Insight. And this is where you're going to really get a view of your quality of service, whether or not you're meeting the SLAs and SLOs that you define in the service, if you're compliant with certain regulatory requirements and things, and also give you a good view of how things are configured and laid out across your data centers. The logs are going to help you, obviously, on the troubleshooting side, which again contributes to meeting SLOs, SLAs, and a way to aggregate all logging for purposes of either analytics or troubleshooting or audit. And we can extend that then through management packs to connect to other pieces of infrastructure you have in your organization, as well as public cloud, so that you can have that control across the board. Now, obviously, this is a little bit of a complex topic. So, one of the things that Rolta AdvizeX is focused on is helping people make this transformation. Every business is different, and we recognize that. There's not one size fits all. And it's a lot like with ITIL, most people don't take the ITIL textbook and go implement the ITIL framework verbatim, right? They take the pieces of ITIL, the structure, the framework, they adapt it to meet their business needs. And like that, when we move into a cloud operational model, it's very similar. We're not going to take everything verbatim. Now, VMware has services to help structure a cloud operational model for companies. And it's very well aligned with the VMware platform. Where AdvizeX can come in and help is if you've got other non-VMware technologies in addition to VMware and other services that you're trying to automate, as well as take a look at the overall business as a whole from an organizational standpoint and from a process standpoint. So we have folks who are strictly focused on understanding your business drivers, understanding your capabilities, and helping you plan that from an ITSM perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, and from an application perspective. Some of the things that we do in our strategic consulting is we look at your applications, especially as you start to consume cloud. And, a lot of folks look at cloud and think they'll lift and shift applications, which you can certainly do. But that's a very expensive approach. And really the only use case there is, you're either getting rid of a data center or you don't have one to begin with. In most cases, it makes more sense for an organization to focus on strategic applications and build those as cloud native to take advantage of, true distributed cloud deployments as well as cost efficiencies in the cloud. So as we look at your operational model, we're also looking at the types of applications that you have. And for those of you who are going through this, currently moving toward containers as an example in a containerized type application, recognize that there is going to be an operational change that needs to occur in order to support that in the environment. So we're not going to just look at the infrastructure, we're also going to help look at the applications. We'll help you build financial models so that you can make determinations about where things run, the cost of transition, the tool sets required, and the investment required in, say, training and so forth, as well as looking at employee roles, what roles need to change, what rules would you need to add to the organization, how are your ratios lined, and does it make sense for you to collapse some of the functions and assign them to existing individuals, and how would you reorg the team? And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. So we have a methodology that we go through to look at your current workload, how busy folks are at, what their skill sets are at, and then begin to plan that with you. And finally, on top of that, we offer what we call Cloud Fusion X, which is a way for you to experience cloud from a financial and management perspective with equipment on-prem, the same as you would expect to in the cloud. So if you look at the big differences between private and public cloud, finance is obviously one of those. Cloud is all OpEx, and private cloud could be OpEx or CapEx, mostly CapEx. And what we are able to do with Cloud Fusion X is provide the operational expense model for on-premise equipment or blend it to your needs. Private cloud is obviously on-prem, public is not. And with Cloud Fusion X, it will again allow you to make that choice of where the workloads run. It could be off-site, it could be on-site, it could be both. In private cloud, you have a lot of control. In public cloud, you have a little bit of control in terms of how you configure the infrastructure. And with Cloud Fusion X, we give you the ability to have high control of this environment, which is really on-prem infrastructure that you either buy in the capital model or subscribe to in the OpEx model. But it will allow you to have sort of a subscription OpEx model with high controls of equipment on-prem. And finally, it's around ownership and management of infrastructure, software, and applications. Infrastructure on-prem is owned typically by the customer, as is the software, and the management is also typically provided by the customer. And when you're in the cloud, infrastructure is owned by the provider. Software can sometimes be owned by the provider or maybe owned by the customer, depending on the cloud. The management of the infrastructure is done by the provider, and the application management is also typically done by the provider in the case of SaaS, or a customer in the case of IaaS. And what, again, we're allowing you to do is to make that choice. So think of this as a way to buy your hardware in your infrastructure, in your SDDC that you're putting together, but have a little bit of extra burst capacity that you only pay for on demand, with the ability of turning it into a subscription-based infrastructure at a monthly bill, if that's your desire, so that you don't have to necessarily move to the public cloud to get that same level of experience. And as part of that, and that's really just the financial side, the other piece that we add on to it, of course, is building out private cloud and leveraging the vRealize technologies and technologies like Cloud Foundation to essentially recreate a cloud provider on-prem for you. So the catalog of services that are required to be built and extended for your organization, AdvizeX can help you build those catalogs, help you implement those catalogs on an infrastructure that you can then subscribe to in an OpEx model if that's your choice. And again, why work with us? Just a quick plug. We look at relevance primarily with our customer, but obviously it's important for us to recognize, the industry recognition we receive as well. And, just this past year, we had won North America's Global Professional Services Partner Innovation Award from VMware for software-defined data center. We were the SDDC Partner of the Year in 2014. Very strong partner with Dell EMC, very strong growth partner with Palo Alto. And frankly, the only reason this slide doesn't have more awards on it is because I couldn't fit them. We've got a number of awards that we've received over the years with HPE, Cisco, and so forth. So realistically, we're focused on helping customers adopt change. We're not interested in just selling hardware and being a reseller in that sense. But our goal is to take people, process, technology, operations, our experience, what works and what doesn't, and help you guys rapidly accelerate your adoption and transformation. And with that, I will end, and we'll open up for Q&A. And if you want, there should be a questions tab in the webinar software here if you'd like to punch questions in there, or you're always free to send us follow-up questions through email as well. Okay, well, I will wait here. I'll hang out here for a few minutes if folks do think of questions or need to wash the pizza sauce off their hands before they type them. I will hang out here for a few minutes, and if we've got any questions, I'll go ahead and answer them. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. It's appreciated, and please reach out to us if you need any help.